Power doesn't arrive with noise. It enters quietly, disguised as understanding, and most people mistake it for kindness. You were taught emotional intelligence like it was a virtue, a skill, a way to be better with people. What they didn't tell you is this: emotional intelligence is not about emotions, it's about leverage. By the third semester, something subtle begins to happen. You stop memorizing definitions, you stop repeating frameworks, and instead you start noticing patterns, not in textbooks, but in people. The way someone smiles when they're threatened, the pause before a lie, the sudden generosity that appears right after guilt. That's when emotional intelligence stops being theory and starts becoming dangerous. Because once you can read emotions, you can influence them. And once you can influence emotions, you can guide decisions without ever touching logic. Most people never realize this. They think emotional intelligence is about empathy, about connection, about harmony. Here's the cruel truth. Empathy is only half the weapon. The other half is control. You begin this semester believing emotional intelligence will make you a better person, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, it reveals something darker. Human behavior is not driven by reason, it's driven by emotional survival. People don't act based on what's right, they act based on what protects their self-image. And once you understand that, everything changes. You start seeing how emotions are performed, not just felt, how sadness can be a shield, how anger can be a distraction, how kindness can be a transaction. You notice that people rarely express emotions to be understood. They express them to get something: reassurance, power, escape, control. This is where emotional intelligence splits into two paths. One path leads to healing, the other leads to dominance, and the difference between them is intention. The third semester doesn't warn you about this fork. It assumes you'll remain moral. It assumes you'll use awareness responsibly. But awareness itself is neutral. It doesn't choose sides. You do. When you walk into a room now, you don't just hear words. You feel the tension underneath them. You sense who is insecure, who is competing, who is afraid of being exposed. You see how people mirror confidence and punish it when it threatens them. You recognize when silence is used to provoke guilt, when vulnerability is used to disarm suspicion. And slowly you realize something unsettling. The most emotionally intelligent people are rarely the most honest ones. They are the most adaptive. They adjust their tone, posture, expressions, not to express truth, but to shape perception. That's not manipulation by accident, that's strategy. And strategy begins where innocence ends. You were told emotional intelligence would help you understand others, but what it really does is teach you how predictable they are. Fear always looks for validation. Shame always hides behind aggression. Insecurity always seeks control. Once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. A compliment is no longer just praise, it's placement. An apology is no longer remorse, it's timing. A confession is no longer honesty, it's negotiation. This is the moment where students become observers, and observers become dangerous. Because you begin to realize that emotions are the true currency of influence, not money, not status, not intelligence, emotion. Control how someone feels, and you control what they justify. That's why emotionally intelligent people are often trusted too easily. They listen, they validate, they create emotional safety. And inside that safety, people reveal everything: their fears, their weaknesses, their contradictions. They hand over the map to their own psychology and never realize they did. This is not taught explicitly, it's absorbed quietly through group discussions, case studies, healthy communication exercises. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. You're learning when to nod, when to pause, when to let silence do the work. You're learning that the most powerful response is often no response at all, because silence forces projection, and projection reveals truth. Most people fill silence with their real selves. That's when the mask slips. This is why emotional intelligence feels uncomfortable once you truly understand it, because it shows you how much of human connection is theater, not fake, strategic. People don't want to be understood, they want to be affirmed, and affirmation is influence. The third semester is where emotional intelligence stops being soft, it becomes sharp. You begin to feel the ethical tension, the quiet question no one asks out loud. If I know what moves people, am I responsible for how I use it? That question doesn't have an answer, it has a consequence. Because whether you choose to use it or not, others already are. You start noticing who controls conversations without speaking the most, who redirects blame without denying it, who uses emotional fatigue to win arguments. These are not villains, they are simply emotionally fluent, and fluency always creates imbalance between those who see and those who feel. That's the real divide, not intelligence versus ignorance, but awareness versus exposure. By the end of this part of your journey, one thing becomes clear. Emotional intelligence is not about being kind, it's about being conscious. Conscious of emotional currents, conscious of psychological leverage, conscious of how easily humans can be guided without realizing it. And once you're conscious, you're never just participating again. You're observing, calculating, choosing. That's when the mask finally falls, not from others, but from you. Because the moment you understand emotional intelligence deeply, you must decide what kind of power you're willing to hold. And that decision changes everything. Here's what they don't tell you once you cross this threshold. Knowing emotions doesn't make life easier. It makes it clearer. And clarity is often cruel. Because now, when someone says they care, you hear what they're afraid of losing. When someone gets angry, you see the shame they're trying to bury. When someone withdraws, you recognize it not as strength, but self-protection. This is where the conflict begins. You still feel emotions, but you no longer drown in them. And that creates distance. People sense it. They can't explain it, but they feel that something in you has changed. You're calmer in moments that used to shake you. You don't rush to explain yourself. You don't chase emotional resolution. And unconsciously, that unsettles them. Because emotional chaos is how most people bond. Shared anxiety, shared outrage, shared insecurity. When you stop participating in that exchange, you disrupt the unspoken contract. You begin to realize that many relationships aren't built on trust. They're built on emotional dependency. One person reacts, the other regulates. One person explodes, the other absorbs. And the one who regulates holds the real power. This is where emotional intelligence reveals its darker function, not to feel more, but to feel less at the right moments. Detachment isn't coldness, it's selective engagement. You start noticing how often emotions are used to override logic. Tears that arrive right before accountability, anger that appears when truth gets too close, victimhood that emerges the moment power shifts. This isn't accidental behavior, it's adaptive. The human brain is wired for self-preservation, not honesty. And emotional intelligence teaches you how that wiring expresses itself. Through projection, through deflection, through guilt. Guilt especially is a favorite weapon. People rarely say, "I want control." They say, "You've changed." They say, "You're not the same anymore." They say, "I miss how you used to be." What they really mean is,
You no longer react the way I expect, and unpredictability threatens emotional leverage. Once you understand this, you stop apologizing for growth. You stop shrinking your awareness to make others comfortable. Because here's the paradox no textbook explains. The more emotionally intelligent you become, the less emotionally accessible you should be. Accessibility invites manipulation. Boundaries invite respect. This is the reversal. You were taught that emotional intelligence makes you warmer, more open, more understanding. But in reality, true emotional intelligence makes you precise. You don't confront every emotion. You don't validate every feeling. You don't respond to every provocation. You choose. And choice is power. This is where Machiavellian wisdom quietly enters the room, not as cruelty, but as discipline. You learn that reacting emotionally is often a gift you give away for free, and most people don't deserve it. You learn that silence is not absence, it's pressure. When you don't explain yourself, people project their own fears onto the gap. When you don't argue, they argue with themselves. When you don't defend, they reveal what they were hoping you'd deny. That's the weaponization of restraint. And it's subtle enough to look like maturity, which makes it even more effective. You also start seeing emotional intelligence misused. The charismatic manipulator who mirrors feelings to gain trust, the empath who knows exactly when to cry, the leader who performs vulnerability to secure loyalty. These people aren't emotionally intelligent because they care. They're emotionally intelligent because they observe. They study reactions, they test boundaries, they refine timing. And that's when you understand the final truth of this subject. Emotional intelligence is not moral. It's amplifying. It magnifies who you already are. In the hands of the ethical, it heals. In the hands of the insecure, it controls. In the hands of the disciplined, it protects. So the real question of this semester was never about exams or grades. It was this: will you use emotional intelligence to connect or to command? Because once you see emotional patterns, you can't pretend ignorance anymore. You know when someone is trying to pull you back into emotional chaos. You know when praise is bait. You know when conflict is manufactured to regain relevance. And you learn to step sideways instead of forward. That's the awakening. Not emotional numbness, emotional sovereignty. You still feel deeply, but you no longer bleed publicly. You still care, but you no longer negotiate your self-respect. You still listen, but you don't surrender your center. And that changes how people treat you. Not because you demand respect, but because you stop offering emotional access to those who misuse it. That's when dynamics shift. People either rise to meet your clarity or fade away when they no longer can control you. Both outcomes are victories. The final lesson of emotional intelligence, the one rarely written, is that power doesn't come from understanding others. It comes from understanding yourself enough not to be moved against your will. That's when emotional intelligence stops being a subject and becomes a stance. A quiet one, a controlled one, a dangerous one. Because control isn't taken by force, it's taken by silence. And that's not manipulation, that's survival. The emotionally intelligent don't dominate rooms, they dominate outcomes.